To our absolute surprise, the convoy was on time. They kept their word. We were amazed at this. The convoy, or I should say convoys, was exactly what we were hoping for. Inside of it was a plethora of spices, which was great because our food, though plentiful, is pretty bland. Along with that, there were boxes of containers of flatware and things of that nature, which I'm sure everyone's going to agree is a wonderful thing. A lot of times we had to sculpt our own or build our own, but now manufactured products are so much nicer. Along with that was crates of tools, mostly hand tools, of course, as having fuel is a luxury to say the least, but still, it is wonderful to have exactly what we need. Along with that, they brought us actually some old plows and harrows, something that could be dragged along by the cattle we have. Oh, this is going to make things so much easier. One of the great things that the women liked, and of course the kids did too, was the bundles. These bundles of fabric, we thought, oh, great, they're going to have to spend a lot of time building a whole bunch of shit. Nope. They brought bundles of clothes, clothing of all sizes and shapes, though most of it was a bit too small for most of us, especially me, but I'm sure the kids would enjoy it. Although a few of our flyers were not exactly happy that things didn't exactly fit their physiology. With that, we actually had to adjust for anyone who actually had wings. Our two little angels that were over there at the, well, town center, they did not like the fact that their clothes were really nice, but they had to cut holes in them to make it work. I said, hey, that's the breaks. Would you rather keep these clothes the way they are or not be able to fly? That got them to shut up quick. We were also grateful that they brought shoes, a whole bunch of shoes and boots and socks and everything we needed for that. It was so nice to have these. Granted, I can't wear them, but I looked at what some of the guys were using outside, and their shoes were coming apart. Some of them were held together by duct tape. It's just absolutely insane. When they finally got their new shoes on, you would think it's from that scene from that old war movie where everybody finally got shoes after their feet had been torn apart for weeks. Oh, it was wonderful. You would think these guys were getting a little schnook from their women, the sounds they were making after getting good footwear, and of course, new socks, which makes a huge difference. What made a huge difference for me, and I was grateful for, was the hygiene supplies. We were all getting a little gamey, so to speak. We didn't have adequate facilities to clean up. Granted, we built our own basically little hot bath area, which was more, shall we say, Eastern style than anything else. We had to because we didn't have any other choice. But it was just wonderful to finally have some soap. The ladies just loved the fact, many of them ripping open packages and just doing the ah thing. And of course, the one that they absolutely adored was the fact that they had actual shampoo. Granted, we could make our own soap, but it wasn't lathering like all that store-bought stuff. Of course, it didn't really matter to me, as I don't exactly perspire the same way as humans anymore, but it is nice to soak in the hot water every once in a while. I mean, I'm homeothermic now, but still, yeah, it's just nice. With that, I was actually grateful we had water filters and gravity feed filters. They brought these for us, and I was so glad they did. They didn't need them anymore ever since they found a way to get their own water pumps working, and they could filter things the other ways. But it was just nice. We wouldn't have to worry so much about, well, anything being, shall we say, gritty. It also took out a bunch of microbes, but we're still boiling our water first. With that, we also got building materials, nails and screws mainly, which was really nice since we had the tools now to knock the nails in correctly, and we had the screws to actually put in, along with, well, we didn't have any type of screw guns or anything, which kind of sort of sucked, but hey, fuel is a luxury right now, and I can only hope that that's going to change very quickly. The locals of the town were so happy that they had no problem supplying us. They were happy not just to have an extra supply of food, But they were also happy because they realized that we could protect them and that we had protected them too. They realized from the pictures that they got of the absolute insanity of what was about to fall onto their town, and they were just grateful. So grateful that they wanted to meet us. There was actually a second convoy that came in just 30 minutes after the first one. We were amazed to see this, and we thought we were under attack at first, but then we were told to stand down. It was odd to see this. It was all civilian vehicles, packed to the gills with more supplies, but more personnel as well. It was a massive influx of personnel, making many of the villagers a little nervous. We realized that we're pretty evenly matched personnel to personnel. Though we have the advantage as far as physically speaking, yeah, it's still a military convoy that came first. They still got the big guns. Though thankfully, they handed us a few. As I stood there, looking at them, I was holding on to that timing key, just trying to smile as much as I could. I hadn't held one of these in a while, and I knew exactly how to use it. Although the fact that I knew what it was enough to make many of the soldiers look at each other kind of sideways. They started to ask questions, and I was telling them to stop asking. We also had to tell a few of the civilians to hands off, as many of them were extremely curious about the way we were. Many of them would go up and basically rub their hands across my wings and find out really quick, hey, these wings move, as I basically back winged them. No, not hard, but enough to let them know that that's not fun. Every time I showed up, I saw people just staring at me. I'm like, people, blink, you're freaking me out. The young ones would always pull on my tail. Seriously, what is up with the tail? It was all I could do not to whack one of them with it. But then I looked at one of these kids, couldn't have been more than 4 years old, and I told them to hang on to it for a second. He said, why? As I kept my tail right about mid-level on their body. And as they grabbed onto the tail, I simply lifted him up and handed him over to his mother, who was standing there absolutely amazed at the power I had in that tail. I had to remind them that it's basically like a snake tail. It's full muscle, front to back. A few called me a demon and a monster the first time they saw me, and of course their own people told them, shut up, it's rude. Due to their actions, I, of course, didn't take offense at all. I walked over to the mayor when he was talking with the military, and they were unloading some sort of strange crate. I was like, what the hell is that? But then they pulled out, and I knew what it was. It was a ham radio. I was amazed at this. I was grateful. Now we had communications. And they even gave us a solar charger for the battery pack, though one full day of charge was only good for about an hour's worth of time on the radio. We didn't care. At least we had something. If we needed them, we could call them, or they could call us. Then again, we could only have it on for a short amount of time. The engineers they brought said, oh, we'll handle it eventually. I just looked at them and said, yeah, eventually. Then again, in return for such a precious commodity, we returned with a whole bunch of fresh eggs, milk, and as much corn, onion, green beans, carrots, potatoes, whatever we could spare, and we began to bring those to the convoys. They were astounded at the amount of food, and we simply told them, we've been busy. We didn't tell them about our hibernation cycle, which meant that during the wintertime, we saved a lot of food. Granted, I would eat so much before the hibernation set in. I mean, seriously, there was no way you could fill this pit in my stomach. But still, it was nothing compared to the amount of food I would have eaten if I'd been awake. I just chowed down probably 3 or 4 days worth of food, got really rotund in the midsection, and then curled up, usually under a whole bunch of blankets, and while I was asleep, of course, a few would join me, but aside from that, I was out. So was the rest of my reptilian compatriots. They would simply curl up. It didn't matter if it was our local lamias or if it was the flyers themselves. We were simply out for the winter, which meant more food to go around. Our biggest surprise was the introduction of their prisoners. They were brought out, these non-humans were brought with collars around their necks, being held by chains. This upset our local population more than a little bit. Before I even got over, I could hear the screaming of what was going on, and of course, I was not happy. Most of the personnel around there were notably scared of me as I was just charging over there with my wings open, just royally pissed off. All the young ones that we saw, and they were all young, about 10 to 12 years old. There was two avian females, which we immediately ripped the collars off and handed them over to the angel and her kids. They immediately perked up as soon as they realized they weren't the only ones, although they were surprised when they saw the avian kids, at least the eldest, flew in and landed right in front of them. It's like they didn't realize they could fly. There was one feline female, which thankfully my female fatels would take care of. She would end up being my adopted daughter. There was one that seemed like a bear, although I'd say half human at least. It was strange. I don't know how. Maybe she was born from a mix of the two. Maybe she had eaten human. I don't know, and I didn't care. I ripped the collar off her myself, and she simply looked at me, grabbed her neck, and then jumped up and grabbed me. That was kind of odd. But then again, I was a little weirded out because this is the first bear I've had to deal with since that whole thing where I lost one of my ladies. So I was a little bit apprehensive, to say the least. The last two was a male and female, which I had not seen ever before. It turns out they're, well, rabbits. With the ears and everything. It was just amazing to see. Now, they were a lot more rabbit than they were human, and it was clear, but obviously they're not exactly carnivorous either. But it was clear that they were scared. Oh man, they were just absolutely petrified at what was going on. I mean, not only were they young, but they're part rabbit, and rabbits don't sit and fight, they run. Thankfully, we had enough young ones and enough women ready to take care of them. I mean, I'm many things, but a counselor is not one of them. I couldn't help them out on that one. Although I can help a little bit, depending on the situation. It was clear as we led them away from the civilian convoy that was still very, very nervous about what we would do, that they only kept the ones they found cute. There was no adults at all. It was like these ones were captured after they killed the adults and realized there were children around. We looked, there was no lamia, there was no arachne, or there was no lizards either. This was making me a little nervous about the ones who had just shown up. But then again, they didn't treat them too poorly. They still seemed to be fairly well fed, slightly emaciated, but not bad. I personally ripped the collars off two of them, and I was not exactly happy as I held one of them in my hand and my claws extended, going right into that leather. I ended up flipping it down towards the ground. I began chastising the convoy personnel for treating them so poorly. Everybody was trying to calm me down, but I will say, even being part lizard, my blood was on fire at the idea of this. It's bad enough we're in survival mode out here, but do we have to be less than human? Thinking about that as I screamed it at them, they kind of looked at me weird on that one, but I got the idea. Eventually, my girls calmed me down a little bit, just getting my attention away and letting me know my dolls still didn't have to talk to get me to understand what they were saying. Once I was calm, I wanted to chat with the leaders of the population center, along with military command. I had to make it clear as possible without losing my shit that I was not happy about what had happened. But I do understand. Considering everything that's happened, calmer heads will prevail. At least we have these. However, we have to pull the visitors together and eventually explain our conditions. Me and a few others sat up there, elevated ourselves by sitting on top of one of the Humvees. making sure that the gun was turned away from me because I really didn't want that 50 barrel next to my head. And we explained the hunger, how the hunger makes us lose control, the changes that happen. We left out the fact that eating human makes us more human. We did tell them about eating the other sex, though. We tried to joke about that one a little bit, saying how the men were turning a bit more feminine and their voice would raise a little bit. They looked at me when I mentioned that I had no choice at one point to chew on a female, and told them that my voice got higher, a lot higher. They all looked and realized that my strict baritone voice, which would make Batman go, "Dude, lighten up," is just something that would make them question. With a bit more understanding, and of course, seeing the children begin to play and be kids for once, let tensions just settle away. Later on, I was sitting with a group of folks, and I began to ask them about my old apartment area. They asked where it was, I gave them the address, and I began to talk about how it was absolutely crazy, and how I had to deal with a few particularly nasty critters, not to mention nasty humans before. Suddenly, a woman ran up screaming, "Oh my God, that was you?" She walked over, and I didn't recognize her at all, at least until she raised her leg. You saved me when that gator thing, they did this. I said, "Yeah, that was me, for sure." "What did you do with that gator thing?" "Oh, that gator? That gator turned out to be rather tasty. I mean, how do you think I grew these scales?" Pointing at the back of my neck. That wasn't actually where they came from, but I wanted to hammer the point. She began to talk and mention how I didn't have wings back then. I had to give her a quick story about how I had actually acquired said wings. And eventually, she called her son over. She told her son I was the one that saved them when they were trying to evacuate. And he didn't believe me at first until I started nodding and he began to smile. And he offered to return something. I was confused about that. And then he pulled out a pistol. This made everybody nervous. But I was sitting there staring at it. It was a .45 I hadn't seen in over a decade. He handed it over and I just held it for a moment. A lot of memories came rushing back. I started by dropping the magazine, clearing the chamber, and going through all the motions as people just sat there and watched. I must have had the emotions all over me for a while as one of my dolls began to get close. She seemed worried. When I looked at her, she definitely looked concerned, and I was pausing, just sitting there as this all washed over me. The lady told her son to give me the shoulder holster and the mags back. I immediately raised one claw and stopped him, and then I reloaded the pistol as I began to speak. "You've been using this to protect your ma with this?" "Yes, sir," he says. "Then you know what you have to do." And I handed back the pistol. "You keep protecting the ones you love." With that, I motioned a little bit because I was wrapping one of the girls up with my tail and one with each arm. And I'll do the same. Besides, that weapon doesn't exactly suit me anymore, as I raised my clawed hand. And yes, my hand no longer fit around the pistol itself. He looked flabbergasted, but not because of my clawed hand, but from the fact I had multiple mates. "Just one more thing." "What's that?" he asked. "Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot." He looked down and realized that his finger was actually inside the trigger well. He immediately put it out and then put the pistol away. We all shared a small little chuckle about that, and then we continued on with the party. Later on, the Arachni actually joined the party, and so did the Flyers. It takes them a while to get organized and actually make it this far. The Arachni may be able to move extremely fast, but they do have to constantly take breaks. The flyers have to make sure everyone's organized because they don't want to land one at a time. They don't like being alone. Yet, now that they've arrived, the night gets very interesting from that point. I end up breaking up a bunch of fights due to the alcohol flowing, checking on the new kids, making sure they're good, making sure everybody is billeted for the night and has a place to sleep, assuring security as I went up and did a few quick patrols in the sky. And then, of course, ending up having to take kids for a ride once they saw me take to the skies. Just a typical night. Eventually, though, the convoy would pack up and leave. We knew it would happen somewhere around mid-morning, but before the convoys left, we made sure everything is secured. We assured each other of our continued alliance, as now we formed a symbiotic circle back and forth. And also, they had their own trade with other groups. We were interested about that, but they were too far away to really concern us. They'll be back in about a month, they said. Well, weather depending, of course. We kind of laughed at that because weather depends everything out here. We assured them if they find anyone else that has to live out here, especially non-humans, we will find a place for them to live. If have to, we will build it for them. We can call us to collect them as well. That way, they wouldn't have to worry about securing them, putting them in chains, or any of that bullshit. We would actually just show up. Before leaving, it is clear that some of the young personnel were smitten with a few of the other folks. We knew this because it was taking far too long for them to say goodbye. We saw a young man about maybe 14, 15 years old really wanting to stay with the arachne that was having fun with him. A few personnel were so interested in staying that they had to be grabbed and pretty much dragged back to their respective convoys before leaving. What really surprised us was a family wanted to stay, and it was a human family. Of course, we welcomed them as long as they were willing to follow our rules, and they will be staying in a small house on our farm, at least for now. I didn't contest this, as of course you want your friends close and your enemies even closer. We didn't know anything about them, and this will be the very first time that an actual human family actually pulls in. Though it would be nice to have more children to have play with my kids. I mean, they only have each other to play with, so it would be nice for them to go around. I mean, I'm still cautious around humans. I mean, I used to be one after all, so I don't know exactly what it's up to. I'm just hoping that my paranoia is not justified. About a week after moving in, we heard a scream. We're like, what the hell was that? And it turned out that the family freaked out seeing our elven neighbors for the first time. We chuckled at this a little bit, but we had to put our humor aside as it wasn't the elves we were expecting. As it turns out, the convoy that arrived, well, another group of elves have saw them and then followed the trail to meet us. And now there were 7 more. We were amazed at this. How could they all be of the same species? And then I was like, wait a minute, I got plenty of my own. Then again, this world has gone a whole bunch of weird since then. It looks like I'll be tasked with helping them expand the homestead since they want to stay with what they consider their own kind. We really didn't argue with this. It's only natural that each particular species would want to band together. Though, while we were building, we noticed movements. They were subtle, but we would notice. Our eyes, most of us, are extremely sharp. And we noticed something was coming. Something would arrive and move in and then seemingly disappear. I didn't know what it was. I couldn't see very well of it when I was up in the air. It was kind of weird. It's like every time something saw me in the sky, it would freeze and cover up. Something made it difficult at all to see. Although our Marilamia was nearby, and he could easily pick up the heat. He could tell there was something. Our felines could also smell something, and I didn't know what it was. They didn't know what it was. At least, until they went in for dinner one night, and they realized it was weapon oil, as one of them had just cleaned their rifle. Yet there was something else in the air, something they didn't know what it was. It didn't smell good at all. We would have acted on this right away, but there was an issue. When you're out here, if you do something rash, you're going to end up very, very dead. So we had to make sure we had backup. So the night that we did a little hunting, I was in the air, but I wasn't alone. I had many of the flyers with me, not all of them, but most of them. All the others that were on the ground were moving in, following our movements as best they could, but they were using their own type of advantages. They would be sensing heat, listening close for movement, any type of sounds, really. They used their advanced night vision to see, and of course there was always good old-fashioned smell to find their way over. Eventually, they were able to follow the heat and the smells and everything else back to the camp. I noticed the camp a long way off, and I tried to signal them, but it was difficult for them to see my hand movements. At best, that night, they could see my wings, as they were broad and just light enough that they contrasted with the darkness of the sky. I could tell something was going on. I got close, but not so close that they could see me. I could see it was some sort of former gang. All those tattoos that covered them was a dead giveaway. And all I could think of is, well, I better not get hungry, because yuck. Those tattoos, they cause some serious issues. And if that's the case, I'm just going to shit on their grave. I could hear sounds from the tents, too. From one tent in particular. It was a very unpleasant sound. Other sounds were joining in on there, and I was not exactly happy at what I was hearing. I was beginning to get close, and then suddenly there was a commotion. I could see many of them stand up and look around as they were being called over by a friend of theirs. They were speaking in a language I wasn't familiar with. I mean, I recognize it, but I just don't know how to speak it. And I could see them dragging something. One of them was holding on to the back hairs of something or someone. What was that? I looked close, and a non-human was being dragged forward. It was mammalian. What the hell was this? I couldn't see too well, just because the fire was making it difficult to look, but as soon as they got it close, I could see very, very well. It was a fox. It was a female fox, a vixen. She looked beaten and bloody, but still defiant as she thrashed around. I don't know what her age was, because I can't tell that from this distance especially. The gang started talking, and they started laughing about her looks and things like that. Many of them started stroking the side of her head and started grabbing at her clothes. They wouldn't be laughing long, because even though I didn't know the language, I knew exactly what they were planning on doing. I wanted to go in and be the first one to crush these bastards. But I wouldn't be the first. By the time I landed, one of them had been dragged off as coils wrapped around his body and was yanked off into the night. As he tried to scream, all you could hear was bones cracking. At the same time, two others were snatched by claws and dragged off into the night themselves. Another two were tackled, seemingly from nowhere, though they came from the sky. And these tackled ones were dragged off into the darkness of the woods, screaming as you could hear all sorts of ripping and tearing. Those in the tents were met up by some of my group as they ran in, and what I couldn't see, I could hear, and it was rather disgusting, yet still made me smile. I landed on one of them. He was swinging his weapon around, trying to get a target on anything and firing blindly into the night. The other flyers also landing with thuds and broken bones underneath them. The fight itself was over in about 30 seconds. I looked around to make sure we got everyone and started calling out status for anyone to tell me what was going on, if anyone was hurt. Status, is anybody hurt? Sort of, was all I heard. I turned, and walking out of the tent, I could see a couple of my group, but they were bringing somebody. Was that a female elf? No, no, it was a young male. What the, what the hell? At first, I did think it was a girl because, well, they're all very feminine looking, but clearly it was a guy. I mean, wasn't wearing anything, so I mean, yeah, it's pretty obvious. Though I did look into the eyes. His mind was broken. He was bruised and bloody, some fresh bruises all over him. Some of the scars were been healed and looks like somebody had cut him several times in the same place. Oh, jeez. I found one of the gang members still alive. One of my female flyers had landed on him and not hit him square, though it was clear that he was some sort of leader. They started yelling at him in that same language that I didn't know. Come to find out, yeah, he was pretty high up, as he was the brother of the one in charge. They looked over and said something, and he seemed to smile and spit. Well, this was enough for me. I was done dealing with these assholes. I simply walked over, grabbed him, tossed his broken body over a large log, and then I slammed a couple large rocks onto his hands, crushing what little was left in his hands, but it was heavy enough where he could not get up and move. I then stood in front of him, and I let him see clearly at eye level what I have that usually gives my ladies a lot of pleasure, but can give him great pain. He began to freak out, screaming and cursing. I know what the curses are, I don't know the rest of the language. But he seemed absolutely petrified as I seemed to walk around calmly behind him. He most likely thought I was going to do something, but I, physically, no, that's not going to happen. I looked over at the female elf, whispered in her ear, and she seemed to smile a bit. She then brought the young elf male over, stood behind the other man who was still cursing and screaming, scared out of his mind that I was going to do something. Well, it wasn't going to be me. She pulled out a pistol and put it in the boy's hand. She then raised the hand up, cocked the hammer back, and put her finger on top of his in the trigger well. If the boy wasn't going to fire, she would. With the rocks, I had taken his weapons away, and with the shot, we could say we took away both of them. The fox girl, who had watched this whole thing, was absolutely stunned as she just sat there on the ground, her jaw open, just amazed at what was going on. She couldn't make heads or tails of it. I asked the elves if they could bring the boy to their house. I mean, he needs to be taken care of. And aside from the fact that he got a little bit of himself back after that shot fired, well, there's not much I can do beyond that. The Lamia boy was able to help the vixen to her feet, and then simply looked at her and said, "Hungry? I know I am." She seemed a little nervous at this, and then she looked to see us dragging all the bodies out and begin to strip them down. She looked over and she began to salivate. She knew what was going to happen, though she was a little hesitant to do so. Being so young, we had to remind her that the differences between chewing on male and chewing on female. The only issue was she was so hungry that even though we were trying to explain, she didn't really seem to care. We gave her first dibs. She looked extremely emaciated now that we could get a good look at her. After the long meal, we collected what gear we could, what wasn't either damaged or too damn bloody now that we really couldn't use it. We offered the vixen to follow us home, and she surprisingly agreed. She would stay in my house for the night, as it was the closest one, and next day she would be brought to the village center with the other orphans so that she could be around kids her age. She eventually said she wanted to stay away from large groups as it made her very, very nervous. Considering how many personnel are at my establishment, we decided to bring her over to the elves, and we asked if we could drop her off there. They, of course, accepted, as they still had plenty of room. And even with the new influx of personnel, it was still the smallest of all the groups there. It was a good thing that they didn't give us any problems, because I don't know if they noticed, but the sleep was beginning to creep in. Oh, fuck the sleep. I can see it in everyone's face. Everyone was just getting lethargic. We got back around dawn. I gave a quick debrief about what happened, sparing the more flavorful details. Before I fell asleep, my mind was racing across several things. I remember how nice it was to have those convoys, those people being so grateful to us. And now we had these folks that were so evil that I remember pissing on that sleeve tattoo that I ripped off because I really didn't want to eat it. A final degradation to those assholes. Next time, I'm thinking maybe I'll just do that while they're still alive. Really hammer the point home. Thinking about the two different groups, all I could think of is the duality. Boy, that was a bitch. The good and the bad, the yin and the yang. Well, right now I just need to quiet my mind a little bit so I can sleep peacefully. I mean, gee, after all the excitement, the convoy, helping build new personnel, taking down a group of assholes, I really just need to sleep.